submitted for your approval one Supply Chain Integrity Month. A slightly worse for wear topic whose title is as drab and undistinguished as app inventory, and that we wish for packages to be sent out to repo to come back shiny and clean. We are soon to discover that software bill of materials has come due, a price to be paid in the AppSec zone. Which means this week we talk with Doug Barbin about supply chain security, the consequences of compromised components, and the core tenets for code integrity. In the news segment, Rust enters new dimensions of Android and Linux. Project Zero sets a timeline to serve vulns. XSS takes a journey into imagination, Boothole unlocks patches, and more. Check the signpost ahead and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. We're proud to announce CISO Stories, a new podcast series in partnership with Cybersecurity Collaborative and Cyber Reason. CISO Stories features the candid perspectives and experiences of frontline senior security executives and dives deep into timely security topics. CISO Stories is hosted by Todd Fitzgerald, VP of Cybersecurity Strategy at Cybersecurity Collaborative, and Sam Curry, Chief Product and Security Officer at Cyber Reason. Listen weekly as they speak with extraordinary CISOs by visiting securityweekly.com/CSP. Cloud native development presents new challenges for security teams. Ephemeral workloads are scattered across services, and it's hard to identify resources, monitor configurations, and ensure compliance. Prisma Cloud by Palo Alto Networks is a comprehensive cloud native security platform, delivering full stack protection for multi and hybrid cloud environments. It provides deep visibility, threat detection, and data security, as well as protection for hosts, containers, and serverless while enforcing policy guardrails. Visit securityweekly.com/Prisma Cloud to gain control over your cloud security.
This is episode 147, recorded April 19th, 2021. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and as always, I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mr. Shima, 147, these episodes seem to be flying by.
They are flying by. In fact, I think this is 2-year mark that we've been doing. So sorry, we missed the paper anniversary. We're on to cotton, so I'll have to send you a like an ASW hoodie or some ASW shiny pants or something like that. And for everyone else, if you want to stay in the loop on all things Security Weekly for at least the next 2 years, visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe on your favorite podcast catcher or our YouTube channel. Sign up for our mailing list, join our Discord server, and this is all new, follow us on our newest live streaming platform, Twitch. Speaking of live streaming and webcasts, our next live webcast will be April 29th at 11 a.m. Eastern, where you will learn how to prepare for and prevent modern ransomware attacks. Our next technical training will be on May 6th at 11 a.m. Eastern. This technical training webcast will explore common misconfigurations of Nginx, the damage they can do, and how to avoid them. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to register now. If you missed any of our previously recorded webcasts or technical trainings, they're available for your viewing pleasure at, you guessed it, as always, securityweekly.com/on-demand. Doug Barbin is a managing principal and firm-wide cybersecurity and compliance services leader, where he spends most of his time developing, launching, managing, and adapting Shellmon's attestation, compliance, and certification offerings. As such, he is privileged to work with many of the world's leading cloud computing, federal, fintech, healthcare, AI, and security provider clients. Doug has more than 23 years' experience and maintains multiple CPA licenses, along with CISSP, CIPP, ISO 27001, lead auditor, and QSA certifications. He is very active in industry organizations and regularly speaks and teaches on cloud security, AI, FedRAMP, and other compliance frameworks. Hello, Doug. You are clearly a very busy person, so thank you for joining us.
Pleasure. Good to talk to you guys.
Well, we're glad to have you here because April is the CISA. I didn't realize this until this month, actually, that it's National Supply Chain Integrity Month. It's also, because we're in April, halfway to Halloween, so the alternate theme for this episode is going to be the Supply Chainsaw Massacre. And I think you do a lot of work in the federal space, and I think one of the things we'd love to hear about is, some of your insights that you've seen on supply chain. Just how new is it really in terms of these security issues we're thinking about, as well as in the federal space, what has NIST been doing, as well as all the other organizations there trying to solve this not necessarily very easy problem?
Sure. And I appreciate it. As I told you when we first started talking, I didn't actually realize that this month was Supply Chain Protection Month either. That's good as any. Seems like it should be most months. But this has definitely been an active problem for some time. I mean, look, arguably our firm, Shellman, as a company, we're part of a supply chain management solution. We perform audits, we write reports about companies that then get shared to their customers so that they can provide some level of assurance that they're meeting their commitments, that they're compliant with XYZ regulation and so forth as well. So this is largely the world that we live in. On the federal side, fair question, right? So NIST 853 is the kind of the core standard for all things government computing. It always has been, and it's been broadly adopted by industry and so forth as well. I was on a webinar a while back where I referred to it as kind of the Kevin Bacon of security standards, right? Because ISO maps to it, NIST CSF maps to it. You're never more than 2 degrees away from NIST 853. But if you take a look at the most recent version, Rev 5, there's 2 things that are new, or there's 2 things that are really focused on in that version. One is, and the first is supply chain. There's an introductory statement on page 4 or 5, something in the document that says, this is what we've done because we realized that supply chain is a problem. So we beefed up the system and services acquisition category. That was always a control component within the NIST framework. And then they went and added a whole other category just for supply chain management. So for those listening, the other thing that's really focused on in the new version is privacy for obvious reasons. Now here's the kicker: this is the newest version of NIST 853, but this has been around in draft form. They've been sharing this version in draft form since I think 2016. So there's been a lot of eyes on this, a lot of review. FedRAMP will be adopting this as part of their cloud computing assurance program, an authorization program, but they're not there yet. They're still on Rev 4. So while this is, you've certainly seen a lot of attention played to supply chain, especially in the last year. I think that's all good attention. It is a problem that's been a known problem, and that NIST and team, all of the crew there, have been trying to address, at least through standards, and trying to get more awareness and people looking into those typical types of problems.
Doug, let me throw you a question.
Go ahead.
I'm going to go slightly off our core focus here for today, but I think it's sort of interesting. It was on my mind last week from some other area I was thinking about. But just think through the list of organizations you rattled off there. And it seems like we've got all these different groups trying to sort of get to the same point. But instead of, frequently it seems to me, and I know there's slightly different variations. I want you to talk about this in a minute, but are your thoughts on it? But it seems a lot of these orgs have slightly different variations on the same thing. So, first someone comes out with an attack matrix, and then Microsoft has sort of their version of it for Kubernetes, and they're going to contribute it back. And then say CNCF wants to do a paper on Kubernetes security, and then the Kubernetes team themselves does as well. And then, CSA has to get into act, and we have to have something from ISO. How do people keep track of that? Or, beside hiring you and your team, does that seem like it's getting sort of too sort of just frayed apart? Or any thoughts around that? I know it's sort of a general question I'm throwing at you, but
it's definitely a lot to handle, and we're admittedly we're not in the advisory space. We don't get the opportunity to necessarily help companies fix that problem as much as we can come in after the fact and kind of take a look at what they have. But my own perspective on it, though, is that where those things come together, because every year there's some new compliance framework, and it's generally built on something that's already there and augmented, to your point, for a specific use case, right? I mean, NIST 853 had its roots in federal computing. and then in federal computer systems and government data. And then 800-171 came along. So, okay, we realized not all of that has to necessarily apply to the whole government, to the defense contractors, so companies. So here's a slightly more stripped down version of that, but somewhat related. The best way that I see companies kind of dealing with that problem is one, acknowledging, because there is no Uber standard, there is no one standard that if you comply with, you're going to meet everything. Everyone would love that. It'd be great, but that's not the reality. But what is common, at least that we see, is that if a company has a robust program, a robust security program, and their own defined set of controls, then those controls that's the center point. If you're really building a program, the center point is what you've done, and you let the compliance requirements, link to what you've done, and not vice versa, right? So.
Yeah, I think that is a great question, because it's a launching point into the CISA.gov that for their Supply Chain Integrity Month, they did helpfully provide some resources. And one, they had this Supply Chain Risk Management Task Force. And I think to your point, Doug, they go through some questions about, they have some very binary, does your organization define, follow, validate, secure coding, for example. But the more important part is, how do they do so? And so they ask these open-ended questions. How do you do threat modeling? How do you determine these? How do you identify these risks? How do you send an email to all of your own vendors if your suppliers, if one of your suppliers is in the news because they've been compromised? So I think, from what I hear, is you're kind of just saying, there's not a checklist here that just do this checklist, you're done. It's more of, how mature is the process you've defined for yourself, and is that actually effective in protecting yourself from these supply chain types of issues, whether it's compromised assets of your own or just secure integrity of your packages that you're sending out to others. Does that sound like a fair read?
Does, and it goes to kind of the point that the supply chain risk management program is going to look a lot different from company to company, and it depends on, are you just developing software? Are you using external cloud services? Is there other dependencies? Do you have organizations owned or not owned outside the U.S. that you have to deal with as well, right? There's all of these things, but yeah, that's to the point when you come in from an assessor's perspective or an auditor's perspective. The minimum baseline may be 8 things that it's suggested or recommended that you do, but it might be you might do those 8 things, and only those 8 things. You might do 50 things. And so I think there's always 2 parts when it comes to conveying some sort of a trust service. It's telling your story. It's articulating what it is that you do. We have the following, code review. We use bug bounty programs, or have our own bug bounty program. We do a variety of things from a software development perspective. From there, articulating, how you deal with third parties and what that management process is. And from when we come in, it's like we look at the program as it's been written. You can obviously look to see, does it meet a baseline set of standards or checkbox, but more so, are they doing what they say they're doing? And is there a process to grow it? In an ideal world, if the baseline is 8 things that you need to be paying attention to, you got a company that's doing 15 today, like to see them doing 16 or 17 tomorrow. If those are good activities, right, that make sense for the organization, and they're doing that because they've done some sort of a risk assessment or threat modeling to determine what it is that they really need to worry about, right? So.
Yeah, I think, in my intro, I was, riffing a bit on Twilight Zone, but I was very mentally just thinking of packages and software packages as the supply chain part of this integrity and security issue. But, listening to you, it's clearly a lot more of that, because you haven't mentioned, have you built an artifact? Have you built a package securely? You're talking about processes. And I think, too, that means we're also talking about cloud services, or just, peer-to-peer services like that, or business to business, I guess I should say. So, as we're talking about supply chain, what are these aspects that you're looking at for their processes? What are either the problems that come up, or the domains of scrutiny beyond just, did this artifact get billed properly?
Sure. Fair question. That's obviously a risk and a concern, but there's, within the NIST standard, there's an entire category just for external services. And that is a significant heavy focus for, if you're doing a FedRAMP assessment, part of doing that assessment of a cloud provider is also assessing their interconnections. And I use that term broadly because there's a traditional government definition of interconnection where there's a persistent connection, but then there's all of these other external data services where maybe you're just sending health information out to a health monitoring company, or maybe you're doing a lookup function for an IP address and you want to get a geolocation associated with that. But you really have to understand, because what's happened in cloud needs cloud, and good cloud uses other good cloud. So developers aren't necessarily reinventing the wheel when they can go out and connect to an external service to maybe get some data that they need, or to send out to perform some sort of function that they would otherwise build in-house. So what the problem becomes, then your supply chain management problem becomes looking at all of those interconnections and understanding, and it's not just government, this could be any sector, right? But understanding, all right, are we sending performance data out? Are we sending anything that could identify a potential customer out to one of these providers? What level of access to that? And then how are they protecting that data? What level of assurance do they have? Are they encrypting our data? Are they independently audited themselves? And different questions like that, right? The whole cloud to cloud, that's been one of the bigger challenge and one of the biggest challenge and learning areas for FedRAMP, is the realization that you can't just create a cloud service in a nice tight boundary like people, especially people in the government are used to seeing. They're used to seeing a defined system boundary that's got all of your system components that would potentially have government data, and it's packaged up in a nice bow. But that's not reality when you've got all of these different. When the cloud is meant to operate as an ecosystem, right? So.
It is. And I think that sounds like it's possibly not a surprise that, as you said, NIST 853 had both privacy and supply chain being the recent meaningful updates, since, it's not just these packages or is your cloud secure, it's where is the data coming in and out of the cloud. And so on an ongoing basis, I guess is what the point I'm trying to make there is that this is a continuous assessment or a continuous security issue, especially in the cloud space. One of the things, too, is, we've been talking about the cloud. One of my go-to questions is, what aspects of the cloud makes this easier or harder? Or perhaps the better question, the way to phrase that is, does the cloud makes this different, I'm going to imagine, from just a component, a thick client I'm going to download and run off of my computer. But I'm curious, what are those differences, and are these meaningful in terms of technical design architecture, those types of concerns? Or is it just, this is same story, same computer, they're just sitting in a different area?
No, it's definitely not the latter. I think what the advantage of the cloud, right, is it gives other cloud services give you the ability to introduce functionality into your cloud application faster, and maybe, an argument in many cases more secure because someone else has already been there and tried it and tested it out and so forth. What makes it more difficult is then, you may have all the right reasons in the world to have done something, and you may believe that, and know that outsourcing your uptime monitoring to a third party is a much better solution than trying to do something on your own. But you still have to tell that story. That's where it becomes more difficult. When all of a sudden a user of a report, especially in the federal space, sees a diagram and it's got connections going out to these other parties, and it's like, well, I need to understand what is it that happens there. So the convenience factor, the usability, right? You can get features to customers faster. You can even get them more secure in many cases faster. But having to explain that becomes the bigger challenge in a cloud environment. And then also, because the cloud becomes your supply chain, having to attest to the fact that you're comfortable in sending your data out to New Relic, Datadog, et cetera, for monitoring, for sending another data out for email filtering. You have to be able to explain and justify all of the times where there are those external connections that you're having to account for. So.
No, interesting. And so there's also too, so let's talk about, you've been talking about looking at processes and doing these types of audits. Have these, from your perspective, have these audits been getting easier? What makes this different in modern computing? And a little bit of what I'm going for here is, we talk about DevOps and automation, observability. You were just alluding to that, mentioning like Datadog and New Relic for, for signal analysis or collecting signals, metrics about your systems. Is all this collection of data making it easier to look at these processes, or is there something that still needs to be part of this DevOps environment to be able to say, yes, we said on paper that this is what our process is going to look like for supply chain integrity, and in practice, we're not sure what it looks like, or how do we show that trust but verify in practice part is, I guess, what I'm getting to.
Sure. No, fair questions. I think the technologies out there definitely make things helpful, because I think that developers want automation, they want workflow, they want tools. They don't, and those tools, especially I'd say over the last handful or even more so years, have gotten better in being able to provide people like us, auditors like us, evidence of what it is that's being pushed out, right? So whether you start with your traditional ticketing systems, those have very heavy audit trails, so we can see when a change was approved, when it was pushed. You've got the traceability when you're sampling something like a software change, where you can see all the different activities. And then within the tools that are used to do that, whether it's a source code analysis tool or static, binary tool or anything like that, you can see the evidence that when those tools were run, what the output was, who was running it, different things like that. And then the deployment tools, we look to them a lot of times for when we're doing access control reviews, right? There is, to me, the traditional notion of separation of duties, where developers have no access to production, is gone. It's been gone for some time. I don't even know why people pretend that it's really still there. But what you end up having to look at, it's when you start to dig into the nuances. Then, so as an assessor or an auditor, how can I prove that the changes to production were authorized, right, and that there wasn't some rogue developer who's then going out and pushing bad code into production? And those automation tools have become the security point, right? So you may have a developer writes code. You may have that developer who has access to production to troubleshoot issues, and then it's the in between. It's the deployment utilities, it's the deployment automation, it's those different tools, right, that then become the security control that say, okay, in order to push this out, I'm going to need an authorization from another person or a peer review or something along those lines. So the workflows get roped into there, and that's how you avoid running into an issue where you have to report, a separation of duties issue, is just by thinking through it in detail and kind of looking at some of these tools to be your enforcement points, whereas your historical, I won't even say traditional, your ancient historical enforcement point, right, was having an access list to the GitHub server and an access list to the production server, and they had to be different people, type of thing. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. You can't say infrastructure as code in the same breath as separation of duties, because developers have created that whole deployment, just what you said. And it's kind of curious, no one's come up with workflow as code, but that's sort of that automation or these controls along the way is kind of made me think if that's what you were getting at. One of the aspects too, so also, go ahead, John.
Yeah, so one of the things that's actually interesting there, though, I think it's sort of what we're talking around, but to call it out directly, frequently when we're building those build scripts or putting that CI process in place, I'm betting, we talk a lot about secure software development life cycles and all those type of things. It'd be interesting to think about how many orgs actually put a SSDLC around building the builds tool, right? Mm-hmm. So when this is why this is important now this month, and we're getting a lot of attention over this after SolarWinds, but how many folks actually, when they're putting their a makefile together, or say a makefile and bringing that into Circle CI or the next step, are actually thinking, okay, how am I actually, is this been designed securely? Where are my checks on this, or where are my audits on this? Or is that, I'm guessing that's only happening at organizations of significant size.
Yeah, that's definitely an advanced line of thinking, and I think that's a great idea, and I think that's a great concept that companies will probably start to put more emphasis on, because one of the things that we've been seeing is more requests for people to see reports on controls over their supply chain, right? Like, you've got your traditional SOC 2 ISO FedRAMP reports. There's now a report from the AICPA that a CPA like myself can issue that's a SOC for supply chain management. And I would think that it could do some of that. It can. There's also SDLC focused reports that you could potentially do as well. And I'm not just saying that the CPA side, right? PCI has the SSF framework, and there's a lot of tools out there to do this. But I agree with you. That's that level of the tools that protect the code are probably not getting the look that they get today that they could going forward. So.
Yeah, and John's, it makes a good point, because we've even got an article that we're going to touch on in the news segment about code cov. So there's your code coverage that was potentially an inroad into the supply chain of, your build process. There's an aspect there too that I also wanted to touch on to, help us put into perspective when we're talking about, the maturity of these organizations, Doug, because you were saying that, and John was asking too, is, there's maybe a few organizations that are actually getting into that point about really adding scrutiny to each point of where does an artifact change along its light evolution from a line of code into a hopefully signed binary. And part of this too is the mentioning of SolarWinds. Trying not to make this always a SolarWinds bingo card every episode, but I think there's a big difference between supply chain integrity and then saying we need to have a SOC 2 report that would prevent us from being hacked like SolarWinds was. So help us kind of put that into perspective a little bit and approach this from a maturity model angle.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, I mean, I can't think of any, even some of the more robust compliance frameworks that would have necessarily prevented that, right? It's that's just not at the level that most of these compliance frameworks are exist today. I think to your point, what's important though is again the maturity aspect. And if you look at a lot of the compliance frameworks, very few of them are in fact maturity. So the NIST cybersecurity framework was one of the first ones that is in fact maturity based, right? It's not meant, like, you don't hear people, thankfully, you don't hear people going around saying I'm NIST CSF compliant or certified, because there is no such thing, because it's meant to be something where you're on this scale from non-existent to adaptive, which is the most sophisticated, right? And your goal isn't to get a perfect score. Your goal is to constantly look at where you are and see where you can make improvements, because I forget the third category, I think it's repetitive, is that's the one where you may have a documented procedure and you may follow it and you may perform it consistently, and that may be good enough for what you need to do. Adaptive comes into play where you've got technology automation. It's going to be your data leakage prevention. It's going to be your automated types of blocking types of technologies and so forth. So that may or may not be useful for you as an organization, but at least you're looking at it from a maturity perspective. But I mean, SOC 2 is meant to be more of a book report and show you where you are. ISO is about your program. It's not as much maturity based. The only ones that are maturity based are NIST cybersecurity framework and the Cloud Security Alliance CSA STAR. The STAR certification is in fact maturity based, and then this newer CMMC for DoD, for the defense contractors, that actually has a maturity component to it. You can't get to level 3 without passing levels 1 and 2 controls. They're incremental. And what they're doing with that program is they're making that maturity as a basis for contracting. You may only need to be level 1 to participate in this contract, and that's great. Get your level 1. You may need level 3 for this other contract, or you may need levels 4 or 5 because you've got some supranational security related impact to this project that you've got to worry about.
Yeah, I think now one of the things you've also been, I think rightly so, very careful not to be just prescriptive. Do this and you're going to be able to be certified SOC 2, et cetera. Your process is good. And I think that was the reason it makes sense is that, as with many things in security, context matters. It depends. What did you say you were going to do? And is that process effective? With that said, I'm still going to try to put you on the spot a little bit. Are there certain things that stand out to you that these are a particular practice or a particular methodology that give you more confidence that that an organization is going to have a really good stance, or they're really going to be able to make it through this maturity model a bit easier because they're doing something in particular? It's a bit of an open-ended question, but I'm kind of just looking for what's something smart to think of for organizations that are starting to step into this early on in the process, and they want to try to do the right thing from day one.
Yeah, no, that is a good question, because you're right, it does have context. I mean, SOC reports themselves are attestations that you're meeting your customers' commitments, right? So I think that the thing that helps the companies grow and stand out, and when I look at them as companies that maybe start in one area, maybe they go through an initial assessment because they have to for a contract, or they're going to handle credit card data, so they go through PCI. But if it's having some sort of I'll call it a system. And there's a whole industry, right, of GRC dash, I think they call them continuous compliance, platforms now, right, several of which do very good job of kind of bringing in an organization's control and letting them manage the process of their controls and of their compliance. Some of them are great, some of them not so much, but I think what's important is that a company actually has a handle on what they need to do. And it does really start with the customer commitments. The compliance, the regulatory and industry compliance requirements should be secondary. It should be primary to what you need to do to provide your services to support your customers, right? So I think having like I said, I call it a system, and for better or for worse, that system may be Excel. That system may be a program manager. That may be something, something fairly low tech, but to just have a means to take in the requirements from your external stakeholders, your internal stakeholders, your regulatory compliance, and to be able to kind of track and manage these things. Because otherwise, you're just responding to the next request, the next customer requirement. We do see that, unfortunately, with several of our clients. They're just going after the next customer RFP. Right. Well, this one says we have to be, compliant with the Singapore banking regulations. So we need to check that box. How do we do it? And it's like, well, you need a program that makes it so that when you get those questions, you can point to them and say, this is how we meet those requirements.
No, quite clearly so. I think so. We've mentioned. I threw up some resources on the on our show notes. I mentioned the NIST cyber. I didn't mention the NIST cybersecurity framework. I have to throw that up there. The NIST 853, of course. I did throw up links to the Supply Chain Integrity Month. They have some good resources there. Anything else that we've been talking about, or perhaps that we've omitted, Doug, that you'd also like to throw on there as just some additional advice or just some good references for learning more about this space?
I can get you a link to. I was talking about SOC for supply chain. I think that's a good one. I mentioned it before. I do like the direction. PC, as PCI has been around forever, but I like the direction where they've moved from the payment application DSS program into the secure software framework. I think that opens up the door to focus more on software development overall. And some of those particular issues. I think there's some good resources there as that program transitions, right, and PADS, payment application security DSS, goes away in within the next year or so. So I think there's some good resources there as well. But yeah, no, I echo what you've said in these other ones. NIST 853 certainly. The CMMC is definitely a force to be reckoned with. That can be found on the DoD website. The current standard, which includes an audit guide. The nice thing about publishing an audit guide is that if I'm going to show up, exactly what I'm going to be looking for. And so, in many of the cases, these assessments are open book tests. So I always point people, if there's ever, like with FedRAMP or CMMC or PCR or anything, if there's ever an audit guide, I always point people towards the audit guide so that there's no surprises. We're not there to surprise you. We're here to look at your controls and to ultimately help you tell a story about it. So.
Cool. Well, we're glad you showed up here because we were looking for some good insights on supply chain in the federal space. So I want to say once again, thank you, Doug, for joining us. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Awesome. I also want to thank John for joining us as well, and thanking all of you for listening and hopping onto this Discord channel to say hi. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.